Hello, my name is Keith Swainson. I'm the author of Heresy, and this is the Heresy book series for the YouTube series. This is video 8, and it's called Two Angels That Are Not Angels. Jesus' last moments on earth are described in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And verses 1 through 8 describe the last conversation Jesus had with his disciples after his resurrection. Acts 1:9 describes Jesus being lifted up into the heavens. After Jesus is lifted up, Acts 1 documents this scenario, and I'll read it for you. It's verses 10 through 11. This is the American Standard Version. And as they were gazing intently into the sky while he was going up to heaven, behold, two men in white clothing stood beside them. And I'd like to stress that it says two men in white clothing. It doesn't say angels, even though that's what the church interprets these two men to be, is to be angels. And these two men in white clothing said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into the sky? This Jesus, who has been taken up from you into the heavens, will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven." Now the question is, are these two angels or are they not two angels? In Acts 1:10, the two men in white clothing are assumed to be angels by those in the church today. They assume this because similar descriptions are used in the Gospels to describe angels, but I will argue against them being angels due to the pattern presented in the Gospels. An argument from Luke's Gospel. And this is important. I'm only going to talk about Luke's Gospel, even though all four Gospels described Jesus' resurrection. But I'm going to talk about Luke's Gospel because Luke is the same writer as the writer of Acts. He wrote Acts, where we just described the two men in white clothing, and we'll look at his example spelled out in his Gospel. When we look at his example spelled out in his Gospel, we see he shows two big differences when he discusses angels. In Luke 24, verses 1 through 5, it reads as such: "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothes. And as the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, 'Why do you seek the living one among the dead?'" And so I want to stress that the first time Luke describes angels, he calls them two men in dazzling clothing. Not two men in white clothing, but dazzling. Later in the same chapter, Luke writes in Luke 24:22 through 23, it reads as follows: "But also some women among us amazed us." And this is later the disciples talking about the women running to where they were and telling them about what they had just encountered at the grave site. "When they were at the tomb earlier in the morning and did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive." So Luke goes from talking about men in dazzling clothing to just flat out calling these men angels. So he's not picking his words, he's not choosing his words in a very haphazard fashion. He describes these men in dazzling clothes as angels. So the precedent is clearly set. Luke's previous writings, which Luke is considered by some to be literally the same book as Acts, just split there for convenience sake, and between the book of Luke and the book of Acts. Luke's previous writings, he either states that the angels had dazzling clothes, or he simply called them angels. He did not simply refer to them as men in white clothing, as is done in Acts. Why is this distinction important? Were the two men in Acts 1 angels, or were they simply men? If they were angels dispatched from heaven by God, they would have done so with the blessing of God and under his authority. But if they were just men, they could have simply been bumbling idiots speaking for God without the authority of God, as many speak today in charismatic churches who claim to speak for God when in fact they are speaking under their own authority. I contend they were simply men speaking under their own authority and not under the authority of God. Being simply caught up in the moment, watching the miracle of Jesus being lifted up into heaven. Why is this important? It's important because I contend that Acts 1 verses 10 through 11 about Jesus coming again is not a word from heaven, but from failed men. I read Acts 1 and it just jumps out at me that these men in white spoke under their own authority, caught up in the fact that Jesus just was lifted up to them, in front of them, into heaven, and they had to say something spiritual, and as I said, these were not angels, they were simply men clothed in white. If Luke, the writer of Acts, thought that they were angels by the precedent set by him in his previous book of the book of Luke, he would have said angels or in dazzling white clothes, not just white clothing. And speaking of failed men, in my next video, video 9, I will critique Paul the Apostle, who has written more than any other New Testament author on the subject of the second coming of Christ. And so that's going to be one of my most powerful videos, because I point out that Paul, who everybody wants to claim is perfectly inspired by God in all of his writings, is shown to be lacking when you compare him to the teachings of Christ, and how the Spirit of Christ doesn't teach him everything, and that he's speaking under his own authority. So if you would click like and subscribe so you don't miss this next important video. Go into the description and use the link to view all my previous videos on this topic of the arguments against the second coming of Christ. And that ends this. This is just a short video, but I want you to understand that not everything in the Bible is perfectly inspired words from God, that there are sometimes faults in it, and these two men who are in white clothing are clearly are false teachers claiming to be the inspiration of God from the church, not from them. They were just men dressed in white and they said something off the top of their head. But the church, because it has to try to make you believe that they're angels and they're infallible, has called them angels when in fact they were just men dressed in white. So please look out for my next video, video 9. It's going to be against the Apostle Paul. And it's not me against the Apostle Paul, but it's Jesus against the Apostle Paul. And you'll see that the Apostle Paul doesn't fare well when Jesus critiques him.